This video is part 2 of Chapter 8, Personality Theories, for PSY 110S, the Psychological Sciences. Now, you've read about, and I talked about in the last section of lecture, the structure of personality according to Freud, the levels of consciousness, and then id, ego, and superego. Now we need to talk about development. Probably the most controversial components and the components of Freudian theory that people just, they'll read about it and they'll go, what was he thinking? At the same time, though, some of the things that he argues, they show up and feel pretty darned authentic when we boil them down to their essential components. Now, I'm not saying in any way that I agree with his version here of what child development looks like. I'm just saying there were a lot of things that he argued that still show up in popular culture and that are easily recognizable as Freudian. So to understand Freud's view of personality development, he argued that personality evolves, so the personality you're going to have as a grown-up evolves critically during early childhood. So within the first 6 years of life, the essential foundation and the basic structure of your personality is going to be in place. So he argued that you're going to proceed through a series of what he called psychosexual stages that are characterized by specific kinds of challenges and interactions with caregivers. And he based the theory on his own childhood memories, on his interactions with patients, and the stories that they told him about their own memories. The stages, as I said, most of the heavy lifting is done in the first 6 years, but there is some work going on beyond that. But the basic structure of personality is pretty much cooked in those early years. He assumed that each stage of development involves a specific area of the body that is the focus of what will later be adult sexual satisfaction. So he referred to these as erogenous zones, so areas of the body where the id is getting most of its pleasure from. So instead of thinking it as blatantly sexual, it's more of an infantile version, a childhood version of the thing that gives you the most pleasure. So it could be from eating, it could be from being snuggled and held and warm, it could be from, and this is where the ick part starts with Freud, it could be from using the potty. Whatever, the erogenous zones are going to change from one stage to the next, and conflicts that evolve out of how parents navigate these developmental stages are going to be connected to these various erogenous zones. Now, speaking of parents, parents have the job, and by parents I should say for Freud that meant mom primarily, because mothers were assumed in Western culture to be the primary caregiver of small children. So mom, and to a somewhat lesser extent dad, they have the job of starting to shape the ego by giving it some of what it wants, but not too much. So you can either, if you're going to make mistakes as a parent, you can either overindulge or underindulge an id impulse. So let's say id is looking at the cookies, says, man, those are good cookies. I want all the cookies, and I'm going to take all the cookies. Now, parent, their job is to say, you can have some cookies, but not very many. You don't want to spoil your dinner. Now, if a parent's going to screw up, they can screw up in one of two ways. They can either say, aw, isn't that cute? Have all the cookies. Take them all. That's overindulgence of an id impulse. Or you can say, you absolutely may not have these cookies. These cookies are for good children, and you're not one. That would be underindulging the id impulse. And that causes problems in the form of being stuck at that psychological stage, whatever stage it is. The fixation then characterizes the types of defense mechanisms that child will continue to express as an adult. So basically, fixation is, for Freud, what causes adult personality disorders. Now, the actual stages, the way Freud laid them out, again, early childhood. So the first stage is he described as having the erogenous zone of the mouth, lips, and tongue. He called this the oral stage. Is from birth to about 18 months. The behavioral focus is about feeding. So if you're talking about breastfeeding, sucking, biting, chewing, and then, early it's in nursing, and then, or bottle feeding. And then later with solid foods, drinking from cups, but also, sucking thumbs, putting virtually everything in their mouths. And, Freud was responding to, he had kids around him. So that kids, when they're little, it is really all about feeding. There's a schedule. Having had 2 kids myself, your whole day is kind of surrounded by feeding times and sleeping times. Feeding times and sleeping times. And it can kind of feel like, everything about your life as an adult caring for a baby is getting the food in, getting the nap down. And in some ways that can feel like this child is controlling the entire household with its need to suck on things, right? Now Freud made it kind of creepy though. He related it, he called it an erogenous zone, where the id is getting intense psychological pleasure from the act of sucking, for example, or the act of eating, for example. Now, most developmental and personality psychologists do not argue that there's anything sexual at all about these behaviors. They are inherently tied to survival and so on. Now, the second stage, and ask any parent of a child between 18 months and 3 years of age, what is the most important thing going on in your life with your child? And it's all about the potty. So Freud argued that the erogenous zone, in this case, and, just bring on the ick factor here, was the anus. And he argued that in this stage, the primary mode of satisfaction was physiological control over waste. So urinating, defecating, being able to control it was an id-based pleasure kind of situation. And the pleasure comes not just from the act of urination and defecation, but the havoc it can wreak on other people. So, if you're an adult trying to potty train a child, I've heard so many parents, and this happened to us when we were raising our kids. Many of us had stories as parents of our kids sneaking off to poop in places they shouldn't poop. Not just their pants, but like a drawer or behind a chair. And the sneakiness of it just kind of baffled us, and the degree to which it was common that we were describing this as parents. That's the kernel of truth in what Freud was talking about. Now, for most developmental psychologists and personality theorists, it's not that sexual pleasure is being gotten. It's more about emerging independence and the capacity to control one's own physicality that's involved there. But Freud thought it was, early forms of sexual satisfaction. Then from 3 to 6, the focus shifts, he argued, and again continue with the ick factor here. He argued that the shift was to the genitals, and the recognition that you have different sets of genitals for different kinds of people. And those genitals were reflective of important role structures in life. Now, the sexual component, he argued that this is the time in life where natural exploration can lead to genital stimulation, that if responded to appropriately would lead to, and Freud was a creature of his time, there is some archival evidence to suggest that he started to change his mind about this a little bit as his career was winding up, but not a lot. Now, so his view of what's normal was heterosexual. He believed that during this 3 to 6 year period of time, important things had to happen in terms of the messages that little kids are getting about what their genitals say about who they need to be later. So there's this physical exploration of the genitals, but there's also paying close attention to the gender dynamics in their house. He argued that during this period of time, kids need to get specific kinds of messages about becoming attracted to the opposite sex person. And who are the most important people in your life? It's your parents. So for boy children, the argument is that the boy has to go through a period of time where he is attracted to and really obsessed with his mother. But then he has to simultaneously recognize that his dad is a competitor for his mother's affection. So he's going to look at dad as the enemy for a while. But dad's big and powerful. And for Freud, he believed that kind of the message that little boys get is, dad will crush me if I don't let go of mom. I love her. I want to possess her. And yeah, I know. 5-year-old boy wanting to sexually possess his mom, that's really gross. Dad becomes kind of the stalwart, stoic owner of mom. And the little boy has to basically say, yeah, my dad will like knock my block off if I don't cut this out. I want to be like dad. So he rejects mom, identifies with dad, grows up, and starts looking for a woman who's like his mother. For girls, way more complicated. Girl, initially attached to, loves mom. But she looks at dad. Dad seems super powerful, and she wants it. She wants his power. She wants his control. But what she's getting messages about is it's all about the genitals. So Freud argued that between 3 and 6 years of age, little girls covet their father's penis. Not necessarily literally, but they want the power that's represented by being male. But being female, she can't have that. So she goes through this period of wanting to own the father, becoming daddy's girl. She starts to pursue him in a manipulative way that eventually gets punished. And she's sent back to mom to learn how to be a proper girl, to be properly socialized into her role, which is the lesser role of partner to a male. Now again, Freud was a creature of his time. Who knows, if he had lived today, he would have the same ideas. It's not clear. And he was not alone in seeing gender the way he did and seeing sexuality the way he did. He was just very blatant about it. So eventually, little girls are going to give up their quest to be strong and powerful like men, and will just resort to having a female gender role that is restricted to that subordinate role. He argued and here's where, you know, a lot of people will criticize Freud, is that phallic crisis, that crisis of that phallic stage, was the time when the superego really becomes fully formed. And the guilt and the conflict about being attracted to your opposite sex parent is what really pushes the development of that superego and sense of morality. Now, after this, after 6 years of age, he argued there was this latency period. Now, some historians of psychology argue that he thought this because, you know, for Freud's reality, you're talking about relatively wealthy people who often had others caring for their children. So sometimes kids would go off to school. Sometimes they would be in the care of governesses or other people in the home. But he really didn't think a lot happened between 6 years of age and puberty in terms of personality development. Now, the overwhelming majority of developmental psychologists and personality theorists think that that's nonsense now. But he argued that, you know, this was a time your brain just starts developing and you're working on school stuff. You're working on learning to read and to write, and you're learning about history and you're learning math. Then puberty happens, and all of the old conflicts are going to kind of resurface. You're going to, you know, start using your now more adult-like body to practice and then later develop sexual relationships that will then take the shape of intimate adult relationships. Now, he did believe that heterosexuality was the norm, that homosexuality was deviant, and was the result of flawed, faulty parenting as well. Now, toward the end of his career, there is some archival evidence that Freud started to shift his opinion of homosexuality, although he never really gave up the idea that it was not a normal way to present. So most psychologists now, looking back at this, disagree with Freud's contention that homosexuality is the result of negative experiences in childhood. There really just isn't any evidence that that's the case. Now, broadly speaking, how did Freud describe the difference between healthy and unhealthy patterns of personality? He argued that unhealthy personality develops when, as your authors put it, the person becomes too dependent on reality-distorting defense mechanisms that can either come from the id being too strong, so really pushing hard on those impulses, or the superego being too strong. Either way, you're going to have tons of anxiety and weakness of the ego. So in an unhealthy personality, what you have is a person who is governed by anxiety. And their personality, what other people would describe as their traits, are going to be characterized by these twisted up defense mechanisms that cause dysfunction in behavior. Healthy personalities happen when early parents have done a good job of balancing giving the id what it wants while simultaneously enforcing rules that lay down the template for later morality. So what ideally will happen is that children will grow to learn to satisfy their impulses in socially acceptable ways that keep them happy, but also don't lead to guilt and anxiety. Now, he argues that we will never fully escape anxiety. It will always kind of be there, but we should be able to balance the needs of both the id and the superego by satisfying our needs in healthy and productive ways. So, for example, if you have a sexual drive, you're going to get that drive met, those needs met, in the context of, in Freud's opinion, a committed relationship with the opposite sex. And if you're talking about an aggressive impulse, for example, you're going to find outlets that allow you to exhibit and satisfy those needs to pummel and destroy, but do so in a socially acceptable way. For example, through sports, or through, one example he gave was aggressively pursuing business deals, as just a specific example. A more modern example, you can play all the video games you want where you just shoot and claw and stab and kill and murder, but it's socially acceptable because it's a game, right? So that's really the difference. Healthy personalities use the least destructive defense mechanism, which he described as sublimation, where you're satisfying the needs of the id while not offending the superego, because you're getting those needs met in a healthy and appropriate and culturally accepted way. Now, in terms of evaluating the theory, Freud has been argued to be correct in looking at the importance of unconscious processes, as well as, pointing to the importance of childhood. Many argue that he took that too far, however, and too restrictively. So his idea of an unconscious level of processing, though, despite the fact that most of us believe we have unconscious processing, is nearly impossible to test, because we don't have any way of directly measuring what's in the unconscious. There are some ways of showing that below our level of awareness, our brains are working, they're doing stuff, but we can't really test Freud's theories and hypotheses about, say, unconscious conflict, because we have no way of measuring that. Research since the time Freud articulated the psychosexual stages of development has found little to no evidence that the stages unfold in the way that he described. While they have a certain degree of ecological validity, like especially the first two stages, parents everywhere will say, yeah, we've been controlled by this little being. When they're little, it's about, feeding and sleeping. When they're toddlers, it's all about the potty. So they're like these kernels of truth, but there is little to no empirical evidence that supports the stages in the way he described them. Contemporary researchers will debate whether one of the key principles of Freudian theory, which is repression, whether it happens at all, and if it does, in what way. And this is another one of those concepts that we just don't have any way to measure. We can, if someone recovers a memory or connects the dots between their current behavior and a previous trauma, Freud saw that as evidence of repression. There's no way of demonstrating whether that's true. So while there is evidence that people will experience conflict and they have to fight to build an ego that has solid self-esteem, while that is agreed to be true, it's not clear at all whether Freud was correct about the kinds of defense mechanisms that Freud described. So while most psychologists agree that defense is the thing, they don't agree that the way Freud described the various defense mechanisms actually function the way he did. Oh, and you can't really let go of Freud until you acknowledge fully the sexism, the heterosexism, the classism, and there's if you dig into Freud's writings in the original, there's some racism involved as well. He was a white European from his time. That stuff is going to creep in there. The sexism is pretty obvious. Probably the most famous of Freud's students was Carl Jung. Um, Jung was a little bit younger than Freud. He was seen by Freud as a protege. Jung trained under Freud, but their relationship, while deep, and in some ways father-sonish, as opposed to being peers, it was complicated. They had an intense emotional connection to one another, but Freud had a tendency with his students to bring them along, train them, but he also expected pretty slavish loyalty. And many of his students kind of got into a situation where eventually they just weren't comfortable with all of Freud's ideas, and they wanted to form some of their own ideas and test them out. So, like many of Freud's other students, Carl Jung had intense disagreements, and eventually it fractured their friendship, and was really deeply upsetting to both men. Now, Jung, over time, he differed from Freud in terms of his opinion about how personality was structured. Jung was a much more spiritually driven person than Freud. Freud was raised in a Jewish family, but he was fairly atheist. He felt that religion was just a massive defense mechanism. Jung, not quite so much. He had a real strong interest in spirituality, in mythology, and in some respects, things that Freud just thought were woo-woo. That's really not a precise term. He thought that it was just, so much magical thinking. So he and Freud and Jung got into fights over that, and that was one of the primary things that really broke them apart as friends. So Jung believed that, there's an ego, and there's a thing that he called a personal unconscious, which was equivalent to Freud's version of the unconscious. But he also believed that as a species, we have access to what he called a collective unconscious that is inherited. So he argued that each human being in their genetics inherits this repository, this immense repository of human experiences, called the collective unconscious. Now, where did this idea come from? He was a voracious reader. He loved mythology, and he loved reading about religions of the world. And he found that across the world, whether you're talking about images in art, images in poetry, images in song and story, in our religious texts, there are images and symbols that show up regardless of cultural context. So, he gave the specific example of children's stories, how children's stories tend to have some pretty staple characters, like the evil witch and the impish rebel. There are all these very what we now call archetypal images. And so he used this term, archetypes, to represent these images that seem tethered to human experience. And he suggested there is this thing called the collective unconscious that we all have, all human beings have it, and it's all composed of the same content that we inherit. So he had these ideas that the collective unconscious and the archetypes had this mystical quality for us. Now, modern psychologists say, you know what, this is mystical talk. We can't empirically test any of this. But Jung believed it was true. So one part of his theory was really about this collective experience. In his version of psychotherapy, he did a lot of work with people trying to pull out these archetypal representations because he believed they gave people information about what was troubling them. His argument was always that you have these polar opposite archetypes, like persona and shadow, anima and animus. And to live life as a good human being, as a productive human being, you needed to balance them. So your persona is the person who lives life in the world that other people see and know as who you are. Shadow is your darker self. So think Batman. There's Bruce Wayne, and then there's Batman. We have a lot of these images in our popular culture of dualities. And he argued you need a little of both to be a happy, productive person. You need to balance them. In Anima Animus, that's the masculine and the feminine. He argued that, our culture tends to push us to pick one or the other based on our biological sex. And he argued you need both. All human beings need both. You need to be able to tap into both whenever it's required. So his idea of healthy personality was this kind of dynamic balance among all of these archetypal possibilities for who we are. Now, another part of Jungian theory, which to me, when I teach personality theory courses, I'm like, there's one Jungian theory and then there's the other one. So this other part of Jungian theory is more like a trait model approach, because he really felt that there were these two broad, what he called personality attitudes. You had people who were outgoing and people who were not outgoing. So you had extroversion and introversion. At the same time, you had 4 what he called functional modes. He also talked about them as styles of seeking information and collecting information about the world that surrounds you. And that's where you get the 4 functional modes of sensing, intuiting, thinking, and feeling. Now, at this point, you might recognize these combinations. So the Myers-Briggs test was originally based on the Jungian trait typology. So basically, you can have mixtures of these. You can be extroverted primarily or introverted primarily. The other is going to be subordinate, something you could possibly express, but not so much. So like, I'm primarily introverted. I can be extroverted when I need to be, but my base attitude toward the world is, please leave me alone. Introversion. Then you have to pick some functional modes. Thinking, feeling, sensing, intuiting. Sensing is you're pulling in information by carefully perceiving the world in terms of its physical qualities. Intuiting is more subjective. You're making judgments and guesses and assumptions about how that world functions. And then thinking is logical deduction. Feeling is, again, more subjective and more emotional. Now, what tests like the Myers-Briggs do is try and categorize people in terms of their overall attitude and then their functional modes, looking at what's dominant in that person. Now, this part of Jungian theory has little to do with the other part of Jungian theory. So again, it's like there's 2 separate theories in play here. Where they are similar is that Jung argued that healthy people have the capacity to tap into both of the main personality attitudes, extroversion and introversion, and they can tap into all 4 of the functional modes. So the healthiest person is going to have a balanced capacity to reflect all of these things. None of them are superior to the others. They are what they are, but they're all capacities that all human beings have. Another student of Freud's was Alfred Adler. He disagreed with Freud's assumption that sexual urges were the primary driver of human personality expression and development. Instead of sex, he thought it was that human growth and development was much more strongly characterized by the need to control your environment and to control your experiences within that environment. Now, early on, he described that as striving for superiority, in which he thought it was a need to overcome the overwhelming sense of being inferior as one is growing. So basically, when we're infants, when we're toddlers, when we're kids, we're constantly faced with people who are bigger and stronger than us, and they control our lives. They tell us what to do. They punish us when we don't do it. That's a very deeply, according to Adler, depowering state of existence. So he argued it's not so much sex, it's power. It's a need to become independent, to be in control of your own body, to be in control of your own fate, be able to make your own decisions as you're moving through the world. So he believed that early on, we develop a sense of our own inferiority that makes us anxious, it makes us unhappy, and that becomes a basic motivation that you want to get rid of that sense of inferiority. And the desire to overcome inferiority, which, early, it's real. You are tiny, you are weak in comparison to the people around you, and you have a lot to overcome. So you recognize your inferiority, but you're driven to overcome it. And he believed that was really the basis for human growth and development. He argued that people who were healthy, who have healthy personalities, are going to learn healthy ways, adaptive, appropriate ways to deal with their sense of inferiority. They're going to become competent, driven, have a solid sense of self-esteem, and a real social motivation. So instead of overcoming your sense of inferiority by dominating, controlling, and harming others, you overcome your sense of inferiority by mastering skills that not only make you feel powerful, but you give that to others and serve your community as well. The construct that Adler's most famous for is called the inferiority complex, and he argued that this was a type of neurotic reaction to early senses of inferiority and weakness, but the person never overcame them. So their initial feelings of inferiority just come to define who the person is, even as an adult. And he felt that that was the largest source of neurosis and negative personality in people. Karen Horney wasn't a direct student of Freud's, but she studied under some of Freud's students, one step removed. Karen Horney was, she's the first female we've talked about here. She was a pioneer. In many ways, she's seen as the foremother, if you will, of what would later be called feminist psychology. She was a medical doctor in Germany, and that was at a time where being female and being in the sciences was just not a thing. Her father was completely opposed to her pursuit of science. Her mother was conflicted about it, but tended to side with Karen. There was conflict between her parents as a result of her decisions. So, gender roles and gender expectations were always in the mix in her theorizing. Another thing that Karen Horney doesn't get a lot of credit for, though, is that much of her theorizing becomes foundational for the work that Carl Rogers did many, many years later in developing his self-psychology and his approach to psychotherapy. Now, like Freud, Horney did focus on early social experiences with parents, but she was not very interested in so-called instinctual biological drives. She was much more interested in how kids are socialized by their parents to accept the roles that their cultures demand. So right away there, you're saying that what caregivers are doing, their job, if they're doing their job well, is to give kids a solid sense of security and a base from which they can develop their own sense of who they are. But she also argued that a lot of parents just don't do that. As a result, many children grow up having a profound sense of anxiety and worry that she called basic anxiety. So children who had parents who didn't provide them with an environment that allowed them to feel secure would experience this sense of helplessness and insecurity that reflected a world that's completely hostile. So in some ways she's connecting to what Adler talked about in terms of sense of inferiority, but she's characterizing it in terms of anxiety. So when kids are made to feel helpless and insecure, regardless of why that is, that it's happening in their particular family, that will lead to unhealthy development. That will lead to patterns of personality that are going to shape negative interactions later. So basic anxiety about relationships, she argued, as kids, we're exposed to a lot of information about the nature of interpersonal relationships in our families of origin. And there's a lot of basic anxiety that comes from that. If that family model is one that fosters a lot of that anxiety, it doesn't even have to be full-on abusive. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. It could just be that there are conflicts, there are confusing things, and that, that person, that little growing human in that family, maybe they're not living up to what it is that their parents want them to do. Or, their own interests and characteristics are clashing with what their parents want for them. Or their parents are conflicted in what they want for their child. That can lead to a lot of this neurotic expression of basic anxiety and what she would call a disordered personality. She argued that there were 3 basic patterns. This is where you can see some of what Carl Rogers argued later showing up in his theory. She argued that there are 3 basic ways you can interact with other human beings in your world. You can move toward them, which if you do so too much, you become compliant and submissive. You can move against others, which if you do it too much, you can become domineering and aggressive and hostile. Or you can move away. And if you do that too much, you become aloof, detached, separated. So when we're neurotic, she argued, you pick one as your primary way of dealing with other people. So you can have an excessively compliant, submissive person, or an excessively aggressive, dominant person, or a detached, aloof person as neurotic patterns. What's a healthy person like? A healthy person can move toward, against, and away from people in appropriate ways and in balance. There are always going to be times when you need someone to take care of you, and you can, in a healthy way, move toward them. There are going to be times when you need to control others. Maybe they're trying to hurt you, you need to fight back. And there are times when you just need to be alone and take time for yourself. She argued that when we are healthy, we can move seamlessly in all 3 ways without feeling coerced, controlled, or, most importantly, anxious. And that concludes part 2.